Thanks for inviting me. I'm going to talk about it's a snippet of a joint research agenda with Soeren Henn, who's over here at the University of Newcastle. I took it that it's Friday. By the way, it's in PowerPoint too. All these people with these over these slides, and it's retro PowerPoint. It's going to come back. Just wait and see. Okay. I took it that we took it that our agenda was to sort of provide some light entertainment, just in case you're wondering, what the heck am I doing in Manchester on a Friday with the weekend ahead of me? And we were challenged, I'm not quite sure we're going to be able to live up to the challenge, to do a sort of counterfactual history. So here goes. Okay. We're used to thinking of Africa as poor and backward and undemocratic and violent and whatever. Okay. But that's sort of not the way, that's not the way we think about it. And I think it's typically not the way people who sort of do research in Africa start thinking about it. And we're going to try to embed the discussion in a kind of, a kind of big dichotomy, you could say, in economic history, between sort of the rise of the West, or what my colleague Ken Pomerantz called the Great Divergence. There's two big views, you could say. One is this sort of European exception, which Europeans love mounting new arguments to, say Western exceptionalism. That there's something special about Europe. We all like saying how special we are. And there's lots of different versions of that. You probably all know this literature just as well, if not better than I do, going all the way back to Weber, of course, and Calvinism, the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, the state system, particular types of economic constitutional rule, Norton Thomas's book, which had a big impact when I read it as an impressionable undergraduate at the London School of Economics. And now family institutions are coming back. It turns out that the absence of marriage is the secret of our success. Okay. But there's a much more contingent view, which is that actually, I think this really got momentum with the work by Bin Wong and Pomerantz, that actually this is sort of if you look at any society which becomes successful, you can find something that's different from the rest of the world, and then you can attribute some kind of causality to it. And so their view was actually, focused on China. Of course, they're scholars of China, but, there's really nothing much about Europe that's particularly different from China in the early 18th century, at the start of the Qing dynasty. And there were just these contingent factors. There's just something much more contingent about the whole process. So, of course, Pomerantz particularly pointed to the discovery of the Americas. Bin Wong's book, it's not so well known, but it's also extremely interesting. He has this argument that China decided to colonize internally, rather than externally. But colonizing internally didn't go too far in Portugal. But it went a long way in China. And that turned out to be a kind of big, momentous decision, by world historical standards. And then there's this, how does this contingency map into economic development? Well, primitive accumulation. Eric Williams, that's Joachim Voth and Steve Redding and co-authors are trying to the potatoes, sugar, coffee, woke the British classes up. There's a lot of work on that by lots of scholars, including Joachim Voth's first book and, Jan de Vries, of course. And then there's all this stuff about institutional dynamics, that what this expansion into the Americas created was this particular kind of change in social structure, political conflict, demand for different sorts of institutions. That's what we tried to look at all those years ago. And if you haven't read Steve Pincus's book on the Glorious Revolution, 1688, chapter 3, Going Dutch, is all about this. Brilliant, brilliant chapter. Okay, so focused on Europe, how do we kind of think about this great divergence? Is it the sort of European exceptionalism? Is it a much more contingent view? But I think that's whatever we think about that, and we're going to side with the sort of contingent view, is that if you think about the great divergence, and the world system it created, it was pretty grim in the rest of the world. It might have been nice in Lancashire, but it was pretty grim in the rest of the world. Europeans went round, ransacking, invading places, creating plantations all over the world. The work by Nathan Nunn and Leonard Wanchicon sort of showed I mean, there's a massive literature by historians, you know, but I'm not going to talk about that. I'm just going to maybe talk about the things you're more familiar with. You know, if you go back to the debates on the abolition of the slave trade at the end of the 18th century, one of the main arguments was the slave trade is basically destroying Africa and African institutions. And so it's not a new argument. But, you know, so that, you know, so the world system, as, you know, as the sort of Wallerstein, in the Wallersteinian, Emmanuel Wallersteinian sense, was created both by the West doing well and the rest doing badly, you know, and that's actually connected to the West doing well. Okay? They went around creating extractive colonies all over the place, you know, massacring indigenous people, and, you know, you know, this effect was so severe, you know, that it caused a reversal of fortune, according to Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson. Okay? And here's the image I always the Maxim gun and they have not. Okay, so here's the sort of triumphalism in the Sudan, the Battle of Omdurman. General Kitchener's argument, army massacring the advancing dervishes of the Mad Mahdi, as he was called. I was a schoolboy. Think about what propaganda that was. There was nothing bad about him at all. Actually, he was a rather interesting character. So, okay. So I want to say, and it kind of came up with the highlighted massacring here. There's a lot of massacring going on and a lot of violence, you know. So as Mahatma Gandhi said in response to the question, what do you think about Western civilization? I think it would be a good idea. That's going to be a theme of the rest of the talk. Okay. And I think what you see, you know, if you start looking at this experience also, a lot of what happens comes out of this very well-defined idea of in-group and out-group, you know, connected to nationalism. There was the in-group, we could be nice to the in-group, but we didn't care what happened to anybody else. You know, since we're in Manchester, I thought I should talk about the 18th century Manchester Act. So the 18th century Manchester Act sort of said, well, it was stopping the wool producers trying to put the cotton producers out of business. And then Parliament said, no, you know, we're in England. You know, we have to have a kind of level playing field. But at the same time, they passed the Calico Act, which sort of said, well, we don't need to treat the Indians fairly. You know, we can block the Indians, we can put their textile industry out of business because they're Indians, they're not English. You know, if you read about the history of the Jamestown colony, you know, which we talk about in Why Nations Fail, you know, the thing we don't talk about in Why Nations Fail is that one of the secrets of the emergence of more inclusive institutions in the Jamestown colony is that there were limits to what you could do to English people, even indentured laborers. You know, you couldn't exploit English indentured laborers the way an English company couldn't exploit English indentured laborers the way it could treat indigenous Americans or African slaves. Okay, so I think we want to kind of emphasize here the kind of violence and polarization that went along with this particular Western model. You know, doctrines of racial superiority, of course, attracting a lot of attention in academia nowadays. You know, which were exported. You know, think about his church in Mata in Rwanda, which is it's a very disturbing place. You know, but I'm going to tell you, or we're going to tell you, that actually this is extremely anomalous, this in Africa, this massive kind of barbarity. But it's quite common in European history. You know, like what's Putin up to today? What's hit by default? It's a very similar type of conflict exported to Africa. Okay. So that's the history we all know. I'm putting a particular I'm framing it in a particular way, shall I say. And, you know, I'm going to ask, like, okay, so could history have been different? All right. And I'm going to start by pointing out some facts about African history, which are dramatically different from the Western model, you know, or the Eurasian model. I'm probably a bit confused about Eurasian, Western, and and I'm going to point out that Africa, developed a very different path of political development historically, but it was a path that made it extremely vulnerable to predation and European territorial aggrandizement. Okay, so that's just a kind of coincidence in some sense. It was just the way Africans organized their societies, and I'll talk about some specifics of that made Africa very vulnerable to predation and exploitation by European countries. But then I'm going to kind of give a counterfactual and say, well, you know, but this is very contingent. So the predation and exploitation of Africa that was launched by Europeans might never have happened. And then the African model, the Africa world system, could have flourished, hypothetically. You'll see. Okay. All right. So what do I mean by that? Probably means I'm talking too much, doesn't it? Okay. So do I give up? Okay. Usually when these things stop working, it's because you're talking too much and it goes to sleep. Okay. So what do I mean by, how would I approach this argument that there's something different about African history historically? And I'm going to focus on, we could talk about lots of things. We could talk about economic history, but I'm going to talk about political history. So there's a great fact, sort of underpinning this Western path. There's a great fact, which was, I think, due originally to Charles Tilly, or at least popularized by Charles Tilly, which is that, one of the big facts about European political development is this sort of shrinking of the number of polities. So if you went back to 1500, maybe there were 200, depends on how you count the Holy Roman Empire. In 1900, there were about 36. In this, this competition between, this European competition took part all over the world. It took part in Europe also, and many of these polities were eliminated. Of course, this includes unification of Germany and unification of Italy, not terribly coercively. Okay, there's 44 today, of course, because we have the Balkans and whatever. All right. So here's a fact that, that any of you know. I don't think any of you know, because we've never been able to find a calculation of this. So we did one. I'm going to tell you how we did it, which is that possibly, at the time of the scramble for Africa, there were 8,000 polities in Africa. Okay. Just in eastern Nigeria, there were probably 500 separate polities. Okay. Every village was independent. They had their own political institutions. They had relations with other villages, but they were dependent. Okay, so independent. So this is a hard number to sort of come up with, because you might say, well, look at Somalia. How do I think about the Somali clans? I'm going to show you what we did. So it's hard to come up with a number, but I think it's useful to have a number. I can just do it the old-fashioned way. Sit down. Yeah. Okay. And so I'm going to point out, I'm going to document this fact of 8,000, plus or minus, I don't know how many, but just, it's useful to have a fact rather than saying a lot. Okay. So I'm going to explain how we got that fact. And then I'm going to try to explain how come there were so many polities, in Africa when there were so few in, Europe. And in particular, I'm going to talk about how they coexist. How did all these polities coexist? The Western path is one of extreme kind of violence, conflict, warfare, etc. In fact, Tilly, when he talked about European history, talked about warfare. Warfare drove state formation, etc., etc., etc. So there's going to be something very different in the African case, and one might recklessly conjecture, that this thing is stable over time. Though we're working on it. There's a lot of work to do here. Okay, so how would I come up with a number for the number of polities in Africa? Well, I could go to the Murdoch's Ethnographic Atlas, where he has this, variable 33, levels of jurisdiction hierarchy beyond the local community. And, this is a variable that people have used a lot in economics in the last sort of decade, where he classifies these different societies into, villages, 114, small chiefdoms, larger chiefdoms, states, complex states. Okay, so it's a little outdated as a kind of evolutionary view of the development of, political, especially complex. The complex is a sort of joke. The idea that a village in eastern Nigeria is like not complex is just absurd. But anyway, so it's a kind of archaic terminology, but there it is. Okay, so I think, so what we did was kind of map this into like number of polities. How would you do that? Well, complex states and states are pretty clear. This is Asante, Rwanda. You saw a bit of Rwanda. The Kuba Kingdom coming, other places like that. Okay, so that's pretty easy. We know a lot about population, kind of mapping back, from this Hyde project on the history of population. So we can reconstruct kind of population sizes in these different bins as well, which is going to be useful in a minute. And here's the first sort of calculation, which is just to say, okay, these things look like states, so we can just say that's a polity. Okay, so those 49 polities. Okay, now we get into the complicated bit, and let's first of all think about these villages. All right, so this is like the lowest level of centralization, and interestingly enough, there's another question which kind of talks about puts these villages into these different population bins. Again, there's a lot of missing data, usual story with these things. But this is kind of interesting. You know, if you thought the missing kind of approximated the distribution of the non-missing, it gives you a sense of like what the distribution of population size across these villages might be. Okay. So you can actually use that to come up with a calculation for, okay, we have all these, you know, we have all these societies at the level of villages. This is not 114 villages, of course. This is 114 ethnic groups. So one of those ethnic groups would be, you know, the Igbo in eastern Nigeria. Igbo, as I said, probably divided into about 500 villages. So within this category, you know, there's lots of polities. I think it makes sense to say, all right, not states, but polities. Okay, so just taking this idea that we can get some sort of sense of the distribution of the population from this question, we can just take the average and say, well, the average village size was 1,730. So then, you know, we can actually say, okay, maybe there was about 5,000 polities in this bin. Okay, there's multiple, each one has like multiple villages. You know, we know, like in the case of Igbo, calculations in the, so we can come up with a pretty believable number on that, but that doesn't work for 140. Okay, so that's just the strategy. We can use that. We can use that other question to come up with a number here. So maybe there were 5,000. Probably a massive underestimate actually, but here you go. Okay, so what about chiefdoms? Okay, so here we just use kind of ethnographic or historical evidence we know which discusses chiefdoms in more detail, like Atkinson's book on the Acholi in northern Uganda, Kenneth Little's book on the Mende in Sierra Leone, where, you know, these are ethnographers who kind of worked in these different parts of Africa. You know, Mary Douglas's book, you know, typical type of population of a Lele village. So the Lele, again, you know, like the Igbo, they were separated into lots of separate villages. They didn't have kind of centralized authority. You know, they were a little bit more centralized perhaps than the Igbo. So we just, you know, we just used a bunch of sources that is type of society which is in that bin. Okay, and they're in that bin. You know, the Lele are in that bin, the Acholi are in that bin, and we could sort of say, well, you know, 15,000 conservative, 75,000 large chiefdom. And the idea is to do the same sort of exercise, which is just, you know, divide one number by the other. What do we do? How do we do that with chat GDP or whatever it is? And then maybe there's 1,366 here. Okay. So, you know, what do we do with missing? You know, well, we just made something up. Okay. So we don't know much about the missing. We could look at it actually. I mean, we know which ones are missing, but if they're not studied by any ethnographer, there's probably not going to be a lot of information. All right. So here's, you know, 8,000 plus or minus. Okay. So this is, you know, this is speculative, but in the great history of clear metrics, and Angus Maddison, that's, you know, I think it's useful. We thought it was useful to have a number. Okay. So how come there were so many polities in Africa? Okay. Why were there so many polities in Africa? And I think the seminal work on this is by the great historian of Central Africa, Jan van Sina. So Jan van Sina, you know, Jan wrote many kind of specialized monographs about individual kingdoms, Rwanda, Burundi, the Tio Kingdom on the Congo, and of course the Kuba Kingdom that inspired a fair bit of my recent work. But in parts in the rainforest, he tried to pull all this together and tell a kind of political history of longue durée Central Africa. And his main argument is that the distinctive contribution and special lesson to be learned from equatorial Africa in the world's panoply of political institutions is the inexorable march forward from local community to chiefdom to principality to kingdom or state was not the only possible option. So the word he uses is refuse. The ability to refuse centralization while maintaining the necessary cohesion amongst a myriad of autonomous units has been the most original contribution of Western Bantu tradition to the institutional history of the world. Okay. So his argument is that Africans, you know, polities were small scale because that's what people wanted. Okay. They didn't want, large, centralized states. And, you know, he's talking about, you know, a particular Western Bantu tradition that spreads across the Congo basin, you know, over the last couple of thousand years. But I think we would argue that the kind of mechanisms that he's talking about, and I'm going to talk about one very concrete mechanism in a second, are generally prevalent in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa, even in places where the Bantu expansion didn't get to. Okay, so refuse centralization. So why refuse the state? Okay, so why refuse the state? Okay, well, his argument is Africans wanted to maintain autonomy. Okay, they saw states as these sort of coercive things, and they wanted to maintain autonomy. All right. Why would they want to maintain autonomy? There's lots of arguments about that. So there's lots of micro-foundations and things like that. We're just going to develop one kind of mechanism. Okay, there's lots of mechanisms. I'm just going to determine one. And to talk about that mechanism, I need to emphasize one fundamental organizing principle of African society, summed up by a Yoruba proverb: a gift of money is not equal in value to the gift of a person. Okay, so this is what in African studies you'd call wealth in people. All right, so let me explain wealth in people with a statue from the kingdom of the Kuba kingdom. So this is King Sham. This is King Sham, who was the sort of king here. It's called the Ndop. He founded the kingdom in the 17th century, and he's sitting here in front of a Mancala board. Okay, so Mancala is this game kind of popular all over Africa, and I'd just like to point out the difference between Mancala and chess. So what happens in chess? Well, in chess, you have the white side and the black side, and the white side tries to smash the black, and the black tries to smash, and you kick the pieces off the board, and you capture the other people, and you kill them. It's like a metaphor for kind of Western history. In Mancala, you don't murder and obliterate the other side. You bring them in. You bring them into your team. Okay, so it's not a coincidence that he's sitting in front of a Mancala board, because it's a kind of symbol of African society and the way people relate to each other. Okay, so these things are horrible, but here's the Kuba kingdom. You're probably sitting there thinking, but hold on a second, the Kuba had a state. They had a state. So what's he talking about? Resisting, refusing centralization. Yeah, it did. But it's a pretty anomalous. The big picture is it's a pretty anomalous situation. In fact, if you look at that ethnographic atlas data and the population estimates, at the time of the scramble for Africa, maybe 20% of Africans were living in something like a state. So it's there, and I would also say, I don't have time to get into the details, these states don't look like Prussia or England, the way they're organized internally and governed. Okay, so let me tell you about a better example, which is much more representative of what goes on in sub-Saharan Africa, which is the Lega people in the Eastern Congo. Okay, if you've been in Africa, maybe a museum, Lega, very distinctive. They're associated with Bwami society. Okay, so the Lega people didn't have a state, but they had a substitute for the state, which was a kind of what Vancina calls an association, or which is the Bwami society. So the Bwami society, any any man, could basically join the Bwami society, and they had these ranks, and you could move up through the ranks as a function of economic success. So you basically bought your way up through, symbolized different layers of the hierarchy. So you sold masks and acquired masks, and the rank of the Bwami society was the basic governance of the Lega country. So the Lega people, they lived in villages, they understood, there were excellent public goods so they needed something, but they didn't want the state. So they created this very kind of egalitarian society, lots of upward social mobility, very like the Igbo, parts of Igbo land too. So this is a sort of concrete example of what do you do if you don't have a state? Okay, well, you innovate, you create a substitute, or at least some type of substitute for the state. Okay, so there's lots of mechanisms, as I said. So let's talk about one mechanism. Okay, about why you wanted to avoid, and it's a sort of cultural mechanism, you could say. Why do you want to avoid? Why do you refuse centralization? Okay, well, remember, wealth in people. People are valuable. So you want people, okay? You want to incorporate people into your group. You don't want people to leave. So, the history of Africa, the Bantu expansion all over Africa, is really a history of migration, of, of moving, of mingling, of merging of people, okay? Because you want people, right? There's wealth in people, okay? So avoiding exit is critical, and bringing people in is critical too. So to do that, you need flexible political institutions, okay? Not like Britain, you're French. We don't really want you here, but if you pay us enough money, we'll give you a work permit. Okay, that's the new Britain. Welcome to the new in-group, out-group Britain post-Brexit. Okay, and one of the conventions about one of the aspects of politics that kind of developed, very common across sub-Saharan Africa, is this idea that decisions are made by consensus. So there's very interesting literature in African philosophy about, the problem with liberal democracy in Africa is that in liberal democracy, you make decisions by majority rule, and that's completely alien to Africans. Africans make decisions by consensus. Why by consensus? Well, it's because you want to bring people, you want to give everyone a voice, you want to stop people exiting. Okay? So strangers could instantly participate in decision making. Okay, how do I know that? Well, probably all of you know that Botswana is the most successful country in Africa. Let me go back to Shapira's 1955, the ethnic composition of. This is the last time anyone collected information on ethnicity in Botswana, and this is the tabulation from the Ngwato. So Ngwato were the largest of the Swana tribes. They've kind of provided the sort of political elite in post-independence Botswana, Seretse Khama, for example. And here's the tabulation of the population of the Ngwato. And you can see the Ngwato, 17,850, okay? Who are all Terowe. Actually, they're tabulating other ethnicities living within the Ngwato, politically integrated within the Ngwato state, but not Ngwato. In fact, Ngwato are about 20% of these people. So here, the political institutions kind of integrate all these people. People move around, people are migrating, incorporate people into this. It's a very heterogeneous situation, okay, and very common. Here's a bit of consensus in action. This is one of Shapira's beautiful photographs. This is Serowe, so state. Here's Nkotla in 1935. Here's, participation in action. Okay. So here's the political institutions, kind of this idea of consensus, responding to, I think this notion of wealth in people. That's the argument. Okay. So what's some evidence on this? We have a paper called Africa's Latent Assets, where we talk a lot about different sorts of evidence, but let me just give you a snippet here. Okay. In English, there are words like stranger, like French people, guest, foreigner, like Portuguese people, they're separate words. So could it imagine a situation where in a language, the same word was used for stranger, guest, and foreigner? Wouldn't that be bizarre? Like, how could you have the same word for stranger, guest, foreigner? Guest, stranger, foreigner, completely different. We mapped, using that we haven't done this with chat, whatever it is, right? So we should do it. Get it out. Yeah. We did this with Google Translate, like sort of like a digging stick. What are the language, if you go to Google Translate and you ask, so we got onto this because it's true in southern Nigerian languages, in Igbo, for example, and Yoruba, and even in Hausa, that stranger, guest, and foreigner, it's the same word. Okay. So where is that in the world? Well, the black is kind of where it is in the world. And so far, the only place, except for Hawaii, where this is true, is in sub-Saharan Africa. So in many, many sub-Saharan African countries, you have this. So, so I think our view is that this is actually reflecting something very deep about this history of migration and intermingling and merging, like I showed you in the Ngwato reserve. Okay, so you're going to tell me when I should shut up?
When you have 5 minutes.
Okay, you're going to put your hand up. All right. Okay, don't be upset. I'm joking. It's an English British sense of humor. Okay, so scaling up. You have to make decisions by consensus. It's obviously very hard to make decisions by consensus at any kind of scale. Yeah, there are examples. There are incentives to create scale. King Shyam. I showed you King Shyam. Osei Tutu, founder of the Asante state. Shaka Zulu, everyone knows about Shaka Zulu. Didn't last very long, but what I want to show is that what that data suggests and what the history suggests is this is the exception, not the rule. Okay. Now I want to ask a deeper question, which is going to fold back towards the sort of counterfactual history, which is, okay, there's 8,000 polities. I made an argument that the reason you have all this small-scale political centralization is that, according to Vancina, Africans refuse centralization and try to give you a kind of mechanism which is connected to this wealth in people. You want to make decisions by consensus. You can't really make decisions by consensus at any kind of scale. So society, polity size stays small. But now here's a puzzle, right? Which is, how do 8,000 polities all coexist? Southern Nigeria, you have this amazing kind of plethora of different polities. How did they coexist? Why didn't one of them go and beat up the other ones, like in Europe? Why didn't we treat them all? Why didn't the Africans treat them all like Schleswig, Holstein, Alsace, in endlessly trying to conquer them? Okay. So how are they able to sort of coexist? Okay. And why weren't the types of dynamics you see, in the Zulu expansion, the Mefakane, or for example, the Fulani Jihad, in the north of Nigeria in the 19th century, why aren't they the norm? Why are they the exception rather than the norm? Okay. And our argument, is that, because this equilibrium, this historic equilibrium of mingling and migration and kind of embracing strangers led to a situation of, kind of a culture of toleration and coexistence. Shall I say? Okay. And I'm going to illustrate that with the Igbo proverb, which is cited by Chinua Achebe, the great writer, in Things Fall Apart. So this is a great book where he tried to characterize the sort of nature of pre-colonial society in eastern Nigeria. And, this is very funny. I got onto this quote because I was working in Nigeria with some friends of mine at the University of Nigeria. I've an American scholar at Emory who works in international relations, and he came up with this. He said, so these African guys, well, why is it that, one Igbo village doesn't just destroy all the others and then you've got like an Igbo empire? Wouldn't that be really powerful? It could have gone around invading and conquering. And then Chima Korie, who's a historian, quoted this proverb to him. He quoted the proverb, "Let the kite perch and let the eagle perch too. If one says no to the other, let his wing break." So the kite has its place, and the eagle has its place, and the kite respects the place of the eagle, and the eagle respects the place of the kite. So of course, if you read things fall apart, you see there is conflict. There's raiding. But it's not territorial expansion on the European model. Robert Smith, who wrote a very interesting book, Warfare and Diplomacy in Pre-Colonial West Africa, he keeps on expecting to see the same kind of dynamics you see in Europe, and then gets very frustrated when it doesn't happen. You see this on all the books, Richard Reed, John Thornton, who've written about kind of warfare in Africa. They're expecting to see something and they can't find it. It's deeply irritating. In West Africa, territorial aggrandizement was by no means a necessary or normal sequel to victory in wars. Okay? So the idea here is that, in this process of mingling and migration and polity formation, these kind of norms emerged which allowed coexistence to take place. And let me point out, since earlier on I was talking about in-group and out-group and, English people and French people, there's something very different going on here. Okay? So, it's a sort of cliche in modern social science that human beings sort themselves into in-group and out-group, like one chimp band and another chimp band, but that I want to kind of emphasize here, it's a very different picture. We're trying to paint a very different picture here. Okay. How would I know that? Okay. Where are the facts? You gave me one number, 8,000. Okay. What can I do with 8,000? What do I know about warfare? Well, not much. This is on our to-do list. There's a lot of challenges, on this. But there's some data by Peter Brecke, which is horrible. I think I only had the courage to put this up here because where's James? Yeah, I think James used this. Didn't you use this data? Yes. Okay. So if James used it, it must be, I think I can get away with it. Or maybe he was thinking, I can get away with it because Robinson's going to use it, So that's like a low-level equilibrium trap. So anyway, for what it's worth, in his data, There's a lot, so this is like wildly incomplete. So if you look at this data, it's sort of trying to look at historical warfare. It's wildly incomplete. Okay, so just to show you, but for what it's worth, it shows that Africa, okay, it gets a piece of Westphalia. Europe gets a bit more under control. They have fewer conflict, but then they deliver better ways of massacring people. So this is just the number of conflicts, not fatalities. But Africa is very low in his data, for what it's worth. Okay, a lot of work to do on that. Just let me say one thing that we've kind of thought about a bit, because perhaps it leads to a better empirical strategy also, which is that something you notice in Africa about, why not territorial aggrandizement? So I kind of gave you a mechanism which is, well, we make decisions by consensus, why it's difficult to scale that up. But I think, another mechanism is clearly connected to land aggrandizement. In the sense of, rights in land is very different from in Western society. Yesterday we were learning about rights in land, or I was learning about rights in land in Ecuador. But in Africa, in eastern Nigeria, for example, land is owned by kinship groups, kindreds, what they call kindreds. It's owned collectively, by extended families. It's extremely difficult to transfer land, or you have to have kind of consensus amongst everybody who has a right to kind of access the land and use the land. And violations of the kind of traditional rights are heavily sanctioned by deities. So the most powerful deity in eastern Nigeria, for example, so Chukwu would be the sort of the big god, whole set of deities. The earth goddess, Allah, is probably the most powerful deity sort of underneath that. And expropriating somebody's land, wouldn't just be, pissing somebody off. It would be an abomination to the earth goddess. Okay. So you might think like, oh, well, who cares about that? Well, whoops. Well, it turns out, there's shrines all over eastern Nigeria. So this is a photograph I took in Oguta last summer on the river Niger. Here's a shrine to the earth goddess. You have these little, the pots have water in, and, you put things in them. You put things and pray and whatever. So this is very common, and this aspect of the kind of autochthones, or I've never been able to pronounce that word, but I thought I'd give it a shot. This idea of like people's connection to the land and the sort of connection to that with supernatural beliefs makes it extremely difficult to expropriate land, for example. Okay. And you see that in the history of polities also, and the history of political development. So a very common type of hybrid state that you see emerging in Africa is, what my late departed colleague, Marshall Salins would have called an example of stranger kings. Okay. So people don't come and, Shaka Zulu did conquer territory, but the typical model is not Shaka Zulu coming and conquering your territory, but outsiders coming. What do I mean by an outsider? Well, King Charles III, where did he come from? Germany, he's a German. His name is Saxe-Coburg. They just changed it in the First World War, to kind of as a sort of PR exercise. Okay. So he was a sort of stranger king brought in, descended from William of Orange, more or less, who was brought in by the English in 1688, to set up a kind of limited system of governance, right? Get rid of the Stuarts, bring in a stranger king to set up a limited system of government. The great study in African anthropology is by Aidan Southhold in the 1950s, and he sort of studied how a kind of type of hybrid institution emerged with these stranger kings. And what do I mean by a stranger king? Well, here's another of these horrible ethnographic maps. Maybe the pointer works. Ah, look, the pointer works. I can't move the slides, but the pointer works. Here's Lake Albert, here's the Nile, and this is just up here in the north, and these people, these groups across into the eastern Congo, and so what Southhold studied was all these different groups here, the Lugbara, the Lendu, the Okebu. They were kind of not very centralized societies, but they had a lot of problems. They recognized the demand for public goods. It's not that Africans didn't understand that there were public goods. The question is, how do you construct institutions that you can control to provide them? Okay, and here's a bit of oral history that Southall wrote down in the 1950s. Amatho was a son of the chief Nziri of Nkuru. probably died about 1880. Awogo Elendu of Abetse subclan, so he was one of these groups that found it difficult to provide public goods, went to petition Nziri, who was Nziri, he was an Alur chief, for a son to rule them, because, he says, the people are scattering because of all the fighting. Sounds like, John Locke's second treatise of government. So Nziri sent Amatho saying, you go break that land, you guard the subjects there. So they went to the Alur and they asked for a chief to come and kind of control some of these externalities. Okay. They came from outside. Oh, I forgot. You see, now I got into the idea that that was going to work, and it didn't. All right. So this is, this is what, you might call the hybrid political institutions. They came from outside. They were impartial third parties. Not quite sure that's true about Charles III, actually, who could mediate and resolve disputes. They had rainmaking powers, very important, supernatural powers, rainmaking powers, and they could provide supernatural services. No rights on the land, So they had no rights on the land. They were brought in. They had what Southall calls limited jurisdiction. Remember the desire to maintain local autonomy, no claim to land, no independent military forces, no taxes. Okay, contrast glorious Britain. Okay. Here is Harold Godwinson getting an arrow in the eye. Great moments in British schoolgirl history. The Normans had stirrups. This is what every British had stirrups. Harold Godwinson, he was standing. He had to get off his horse because they didn't have stirrups. So he had to fight on his feet. That turned out to be pretty lousy when the Normans had stirrups. You can see the Normans cutting down some poor Anglo-Saxon. Anyway, what did William the Conqueror do when he got to England? He expropriated the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy and grabbed all their between tenants, chief, or whatever it was. Okay, so this is from the Bayeux Tapestry, of course. So this is a very un-African thing. That's what I'm trying to say. Okay, this is the European model of territorial aggrandizement. The Normans, specialized in the specialized all over Europe, of course, southern Italy. It's an anomalous situation for Africa. Okay, I'm trying to contrast this with the Alur, where the British, of course, according to William the Conqueror, the British did invite him in. They were just a bit reluctant. Okay, so where's the big counterfactual? How long do I have left? Oh, brilliant. Okay. I'm trying to time this exactly so nobody has any room to ask questions. So what's the big counterfactual? All right. So I think, this organization of African society, it's perfectly logical, okay? But it made it extremely vulnerable to Western predation. Southall actually has a brilliant discussion of this in the last chapter of his book. Amatho, remember Amatho was the Alur king who was sent to rule. Amatho came like you government people. So this is quoting, one of the people he interviewed in the 1950s. Amatho came like you government people. He thinks the anthropologist is a government person. That's kind of interesting. If you look at in the Afrobarometer, they have this question about, do you think the interviewer is coming from the government? And they often do. Okay. The Amathos, like you government people, came founders in this country. Alur came slowly, like you British. Okay. So the last chapter, Southall sort of says, Africans were so used to be ruled by outsiders that they just thought this was a new kind of incarnation of this stranger king model. The English were stranger kings. Of course, they didn't have the Maxim gun, one of those great fruits of modern technology and Western creativity, and the other slavery. But it's very hard to understand, how Africa kind of got into the supply side of the slave trade so readily without understanding this notion of wealth in people and how the slaves, slavery was endemic in Africa, but slavery was part of a whole kind of spectrum of institutions for, controlling and regulating and relating to people. Okay, so it's part of this whole wealth in people. Okay, but I want to say, Africa turned out to be super vulnerable to all of these mechanisms and more, but the fact that these mechanisms played out is somehow contingent on what we were talking about earlier. So let me back up and say, okay, so what's the counterfactual? So Africa, there's a logic to how things played out in Africa. It made it very vulnerable to European expansion. But European expansion only had those terrible effects because the Europeans got ahead in this sort of great divergence. So how could they not have got ahead? Well, think about this contingent explanation, okay? And think about the demography of the Americas. Maybe tuberculosis and smallpox and other things had actually disseminated across the Bering Strait, or whoever, the Vikings had brought them to America. So by the time Christopher Columbus showed up, the Americans were immune to smallpox and tuberculosis and all these things that subsequently wiped out 90% of the population. So instead of a tabula rasa, the Americas were full of people, okay? So why is that interesting as a counterfactual? Well, because the Europeans wouldn't have been able to control America, and they wouldn't have been able to set up these plantations and kind of grab all this land, okay? So no plantations, no demand for African slaves, no devastation of Africa through the slave trade, no primitive accumulation for capitalism, Eric Williams, etc. No sugar rush or industrious revolution, Jan de Vries, and going back to Acemoglu, Johnson, Robinson, no commercial impulse to improve the institutions of Atlantic traders. So if you believe the kind of Pomeranzian Wong view of the world, if you kind of shut down the Americas, how could you shut down the Americas? You just basically assume that the population didn't all die, okay? So that was a completely different situation. And then all of these mechanisms that drove the Industrial Revolution or the Great Divergence, they don't operate, okay? So no great divergence. Then what? Oh, no great divergence. Europe, China, Africa didn't get devastated by the slave trade. Europeans sources to launch colonialism. Nothing happened. Well, there's a much more egalitarian world, People look at everybody else. Here's Peter the Great, his embassy. It's not 68. Sorry. That's 1698. Peter the Great learning the arts of shipbuilding in the Netherlands, the great embassy. The Iwakura mission to Europe, this is the first mission that the Japanese sent out after the Meiji Restoration to try to learn, okay, how do the Westerners do things, and what do we like, and what do we don't like, and what do we want to import, and what do we want to keep out, And just to say, well, the Africans were doing that too. Here's an ambassador from the Kingdom of the Congo to the Dutch Republic in 1643. So Africans were doing this. At the conference of Berlin, by the way, where the Europeans divided up Africa or whatever, Africans sent delegations. The Kingdom of Malagasy sent a delegation of August. They wear top hats and fur coats and things like that. The Africans went. They were trying to influence it. Of course, the Europeans didn't come, but they tried to influence it. Maybe in a different, where the Great Divergence happened, and everyone was much more equal. There was much more scope from learning from different sorts of models, like the Japanese learnt from just Peter the Great learnt from the West. Maybe he should have paid more attention. And the Africans were learning, and maybe we'd have been learning from the Africans. So I think what you could think of here is a situation which is much more egalitarian, where there's these different models. Which model wins? The model wasn't imposed by the Maxim gun. Maybe there was more scope for actually deciding what way to organize your society, which is kind of like the picture we've been trying to paint of African political history. I imagine the West had been able to consider alternative models, and get a more equal perspective prior to the modern period. You didn't have to wait until all the barbarity of the First and Second World War and the Holocaust, in order to set up the United Nations and the European Union. Maybe we could have had a world system inspired by, African culture and history. Couldn't resist. This is the Western model. This is fascism. This is exactly the model of Hitler. This is the European model. There's the in-group, there's the Russians and everybody else, just like the folk and everybody else, and just like the English. I think the English didn't really have the. Anyway, so, maybe we'd have had an African world system. I like this picture. This is Nelson Mandela. This is Pienaar, the captain of the South African rugby team. He just won the World Cup. The white guy. Afrikaner. Rugby was the South Africa. Okay. So He put a Springbok shirt on, and he made up with the Afrikaners. So, let's see, the Putin and the Ukrainian national soccer team shirt. Not going to happen. There's going to be a fight to the death. Okay, so they call this Ubuntu in Southern Africa. Okay, that's all they have.